welcome to Growing with the Stars, where we talk about how astrology can help you make the most of your life, as well as nerd out on history and other astrology adjacent topics. And I am Katie, your resident traditional astrologer and yappy Gemini.
And I'm Kat, and I am your fire sign full of hot air. Also very yappy.
Today, we are on to the third part. This, I'm not sure if we're going to finish today or not, but we are definitely on the third part of looking at Jewish history through the lens of astrology, trying to understand and track major moments and the trends that we are seeing. And we are now getting to the modern era. You can check out episodes 1 and 2. They are linked below, where we talk about all of a lot of the stuff that happened before this. And as a general reminder, I am Jewish. I am Ashkenazi, so Eastern European descent. And so, like, this is not a comprehensive of everything that has ever happened to Jewish people. I think that would be its own podcast as far as astrology goes. But we're seeing this as a jumping off point for more astrological research and getting more nuanced in understanding and recognizing patterns and how those patterns might be showing up. If we have time, we will also be talking about what is coming up and what's coming, and there's a lot coming up ahead. That's what my research is showing. So let's get into it.
Where are we starting today? Where did we leave off? Where are we starting?
Great question. So we ended with the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. And during the medieval period, right, and before then, Jews don't always have a lot of rights wherever they're at. And specifically in Europe, they're not treated as like level citizens, right? They're not allowed to vote in many places or hold civic roles. They're banned from certain like jobs, some of the guilds, which are really important in the medieval period. And they could also easily be, like, as they were in Spain, expelled and lose their land and assets because this happens throughout Europe. England actually is some of like one of the earlier ones in 1290, but France does it in the 14th century and then in Provence in 1512. We see it in Germany in the 1350s, and the Papal States as late as 1569. So there's a major shift at the end of the 18th century or the end of the 1700s, where we start to see ideas around treating Jews as equal citizens under the law. And this is a critical moment changing Jewish life really forever, and define sort of the major religious movements we see today, whether it's how much to assimilate into society or not. The one law that really kicks off the emancipation of the Jews in France, or the Jews in Europe, is France, as I said. Um, and we see the law passing their assembly in September 27, 1791. And this is the first act of full emancipation by a Christian state, and it's historic. So let's take a look at the chart. Once again, we have an eclipse. Super interesting. We actually have a Libra solar eclipse, right? That happens that day as the moon moves into Libra later in the day, and a giant Libra stellium that is, by the time of the eclipse, you're going to have the moon, the sun, Jupiter, and Mercury, and Neptune. So that's 5 planets, all hanging out in Libra. And there are some interesting things we don't see if you've been on some of the earlier episodes. I've been harping on the cardinal T square. There is no cardinal T square here unless you're working with Chiron, which we haven't really been doing in these episodes. Chiron sort of is a more minor object. Um, but it is a very important chart. We're seeing, right, we're seeing major outer planets in Libra and Aries, two of the cardinal signs. And so that's super fascinating. And we also see, once again, Mars and Uranus getting closer and closer together they're about 7 degrees apart. It's a little wide, but they're hanging out in Leo together. So we're seeing a lot of these similar themes. And another theme that was especially in the first episode with some of the ancient period where we saw major changes in social legal status is Pluto is back in Aquarius. So this echoes the the rise of the Hasmoneans, who were the dynasty, the like kind of last Jewish dynasty in what is Israel, Palestine now, through the Maccabee revolt, and also echoes the fall of the Second Temple when the 70 CE when Jews the major diaspora occurs, sending Jews around the Mediterranean.
So with Chiron, what's the reason we don't specifically bring that into this picture?
Chiron is not really, I mean, Chiron's not a planet. I believe it's believe he's a trans Neptune object. So he's one of the like sort of he's not quite an asteroid. It's a specific type of planetary body within astronomy. Um, and so he's a more minor figure, typically speaking. Uh, Definitely work with it in client charts all the time, and I think there's an importance to it, but we haven't been weighing Chiron in any of the previous ones, and so it would feel a little disingenuous now to suddenly bring that in as like an equal player to like fit a hypothesis. And so I think I'm just trying to check my own bias on that. Um, but I do think we still see major cardinal energy here. And I do think the what's so interesting is also some of the ongoing themes that are beyond the cardinal T-square, the Pluto and Aquarius, the outer planets and the cardinal signs are all happening in eclipse as part of it as well, all highlighting sort of a major moment, particularly in law, which is very much what Libra's domain is.
That was about to be my next question was is it's all heavy Libra energy, very, very heavy, right?
It's a lot of Libra energy, and it's also interesting because some of the major planets, or like the major planet when we look at Libra, is what is Venus doing? She's the ruler of Libra. And interestingly, she is in what's called detriment or exile up in Scorpio, right? She's in Mars's home sign, far from her own home, because we're seeing Scorpio is opposing Taurus, her other home sign, which is sort of how detriment works. And I do think it's interesting to sort of think about it as there's an interesting focus in this chart, both about the law, but also who has been in places of weakness in the law. So we see that. We see Pluto with this aspect also of as well from Aquarius about who is the outsider and the power and like what should outsiders be having or not having within the law can also be sort of a discussion in this chart. And we see the final interesting piece is the sort of Saturn and fall. So Saturn is in Aries, uh, which might sound familiar because yeah, Saturn goes back into Aries in early 2026. And there is something very interesting about this to see Saturn, this place of tradition, authority, structure, in a place of corruption and corrosion and fall in Aries. And so we see the corruption and the corrosion of maybe structures that were harming people or harming the marginalized. And that sort of is being seen as like the emancipation of a group that like did not have a lot of legal rights traditionally.
Do we think those now, not do we think, but will those will this kind of Libra stack present itself again? Or is this pretty like intense?
This Libra stack can occur again. It's not going to be occurring, I think, in our lifetime because, like, with the Neptune part of the stack, right? So we have currently Neptune in Aries, and the opposite, or Neptune is dipping between Pisces and Aries, and Neptune will move, full time into Aries early next year. Um, and I bring that up to say that, like, we will probably see a stack like this um, in a couple of years, right? As we get to Jupiter in Libra and, getting the Sun, Moon, and Mercury in Libra, super common. Neptune won't be part of that stack. It's just physically impossible. So we might be looking at other more minor planets, but we would see maybe a stack in Libra opposing Saturn and Neptune, which is a different vibe.
So nothing quite like this is set to happen, but we will see planets similarly back in Libra coming up, and maybe something on another chart. We'll see something similar that will come up as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing to keep in mind that that's not happening in our lifetime, or at least not in our lifetime. What do I mean? Not for decades, is a Pluto-Uranus opposition, which is also very loud in this chart. So we see Pluto up at 20 Aquarius, Uranus at 17 Leo, and that really dominates a lot of this period when you're looking at charts, is that the Pluto-Uranus opposition is they both move pretty slowly, and so they're going to be in this long-term opposition with each other for a while. And so through I don't remember the exact dates, but like this has been an ongoing transit that we have seen if you're looking at the late 1780s, the early 1790s. So that's another key piece is that the outer planets here are placed a little bit more antagonistically to each other, right? We've got oppositions happening more than we do trines or sextiles and the harmonious angles, which is really what's going to dominate our era. Is Pluto and Neptune and Uranus are going to be in close alignment with each other for multiple years. Pluto and Neptune for even longer. And so that's a very different vibe. The next thing I actually want to talk about, I'm sort of pivoting a little bit, is I want to talk we're going to actually jump ahead to the 1930s. And we're going to talk about a failed painter who becomes chancellor in Germany. And as many of you know what happens, this changes Jewish life in Europe forever. A third of Jews, a third of the Jewish population is gone. It's just we have not actually, I think, reached the same population levels as what was existing then. Just to kind of give you a context, um, this is a major, it can't be understated how important it is and how much it changes, I think, the trajectory of history and Jewish experience, Jewish trauma in the modern moment. So we're looking at the moment he becomes chancellor, right? So this is January 30th, 1933. I don't have a good time chart for this. If I'm sure somebody has it somewhere, my World War II folks. And this chart is striking for a couple of reasons. We once again do have the cardinal T square. Particularly like so we were talking about the Pluto Uranus opposition in the last chart in the 1790s. Now we're in a Pluto Uranus square. So Uranus is back in Aries, Pluto is down in Cancer. They're within 3 degrees. My math is probably off. They might be within 2 degrees. Very, very tight. And then Venus is up in Capricorn, kind of being creating that third part, the third planet. Interestingly, I talk about triggers a lot in charts. So these, three were kind of getting into what we would call orb for a hot minute. Venus is not like Venus moves pretty quickly, but like she's not exactly there yet. She's straddling between Uranus and Pluto. She's at 20. Interestingly, that same day, uh, the moon entered Aries. And the moon's an incredibly fast planet. And sometimes the moon can be a trigger planet, activating, a set of aspects that were sort of kindling, waiting for fire, right? The moon sort of is acting like a match here. The moon's not there yet, but it's interesting. Sometimes all it takes is sort of the sign ingress for things to really heat up. So we do see the square, or the T square. And I'm not sure what to think about all of this, the Virgo stuff quite yet, but we do have some Aquarius. Pluto is obviously not an Aquarius for this. And Mars and Uranus are actually in what we call a version in this chart. They can't see each other traditionally. So they're not quite acting like the spark or the kindling this time around. You do have a Mars retrograde in this. There's a sort of revision that it likes to do. And Uranus is in Aries, and so there is this sort of innovation, irritation, and focus on Aries topics, which, war is one of them. I think we also see kind of Pluto in Cancer, the sign of Cancer, can also speak to the shadow and the power dynamics of xenophobia and nationalism really can come up in the sign of Cancer. Might feel a little on the nose. The United States has multiple planets in the sign of Cancer, for better or worse. And I think the other piece that's very striking is the Venus in Capricorn is the sort of traditional values. It has a kind of conservative femininity. Sometimes it's the like return to tradition and or upholding tradition, which is what we saw. It's funny how the Maccabean revolt keeps coming up for me. So the Maccabean revolt also had a Venus in Capricorn or Mars in Capricorn apex. Venus was there first and then Mars. And there is this real focus in that, in this return to tradition, this keeping of tradition, this holding of lineage and legacy. And there can be real beauty in that, and there can also be real harm in that, to saying like which tradition, which legacy are we holding on to, and like who is in and who is out, right? Becomes a major piece of that. In this case, we have basically nationalism, patriotism, the push as well for like conservative traditions, and they're all finding release through violence, right? They're finding release through Aries. They're finding release in the sudden push to take over power. Um, if Libra, I'm not saying that Aries is lawlessness, but it is interesting to see it as the sign that opposes a lot of the law and structure that we tend to see that Libra has. And yeah, the failed painter, did a lot of dismantling of the systems that they had in the Weimar Republic. And so I think that is something interesting to think about and keep in mind. I wanted to take a look initially at I want to take a look at a couple things. First, I want to look at the painter's birth chart because we've been talking also about kind of famous people in relationship to some of these. And then after that, we're going to dip into a little bit about Zionism, the founder of Zionism, as well as Israel, because we have to talk about it no matter how you feel about that state. Um, Not talking about it is like is just saying the zoo doesn't exist when you're talking about elephants. So this is his chart. We have a great time chart for him. I do find a couple things pretty interesting. He has a lot of cardinal placements and cardinal stuff. I wouldn't call it a proper T square. Um, right, he has this Uranus Mercury opposition, but they're pretty late, whereas his Moon Jupiter conjunction in Capricorn are pretty early. So there's definitely like cardinal tension in this chart, but I think if we were just going off the hypothesis of cardinal placements, it wouldn't be enough to be like this guy is becomes a major figure in Jewish life, right? And becomes this critical person. And just something interesting to sort of think about and keep in mind as we're sort of looking at this, what sort of is lining up and not.
Is that what's in retrograde in Libra? It's like Uranus or
It is Uranus. It's
okay.
really common to see outer planets retrograde because
Yeah.
they're retrograde for so much of the year.
Yeah. One of the chaos goblins there
I
right across
think
from Mars and Taurus. Yeah.
I think he might also have Venus retrograde in his chart. Let me just
That's
scroll
what it looks
down.
like.
Yeah. So yeah, that's also interesting that the ascendant ruler, so Venus rules Libra and Taurus, and in this case Venus is retrograde in the chart. And so yeah, Venus, incredibly important planet. And actually, interestingly, he was having, sorry, I'm just looking at something real quick. So it wasn't quite on his natal stuff, but it's very striking to see that he was born with Jupiter and the moon at the end of Capricorn. So his stuff, or is it early Capricorn? Sorry. That's interesting. So when the moon moved into Aries, sorry, so his stuff is like, imagine a moon Jupiter right here at the beginning of Capricorn. So the day of this event, his moon and Jupiter are like starkly overcoming this moon, which is just interesting to sort of see him sort of dominating this moment, right? He sort of forces his way into all of this. And the T square then activates, right? It activates his natal Mercury. Uranus is getting close to his natal Mercury. I believe Pluto is getting pretty close to his midheaven. Let me check. No, his midheaven's Leo. Never mind. He hasn't even hit his midheaven yet. Just it would be something more to actually look into is this chart against his own chart and to see what's really coming up in it. Okay, we are back. We have 1933 is the outside wheel, the event, and then the inside is the painter. So a couple of the interesting things are definitely going on, right? We see Uranus is he's in a Uranus opposition. Talk about a midlife crisis. And with his Uranus, we see a grand cross. So basically, I want you to notice, right? So we see his Uranus is down here, right? Transiting Uranus at the time is up here. Venus is down here in Capricorn, and she is opposing Pluto up there. So all four of these together are creating an intense grand cross. It is quite a lot to see. We also just see, all of the Aquarius placements, interestingly, are highlighting like Mercury is on his IC. So all of the stuff around the home, like home, family lineage, a lot of the traditional value stuff really is articulated in this moment. And interestingly, he's starting his Saturn opposition. So Saturn has been in Aquarius at this point for a little while. He has Saturn up in the 11th, uh, which I do think kind of highlights it's not his biggest challenge, but one of his biggest challenges in life, or one of his challenging areas in life, is supporters, alliances. Uh, Interestingly, the masses often comes up in the 11th house, and right now he has much more great strength in that by leaning into the Aquarius placement because Saturn is at home in Aquarius. So that in some ways is very beneficial for him. Uh, yeah, and his most difficult planet because he's a day chart. He just squeaked into being a day chart, is Mars. And Mars right now is sort of sluggish. It's retrograde. It's hidden in his 12th house. It's beneficial, what you would want in an election or timing of an event. So yeah, I mean, you will definitely see significant moments in people's lives usually shows up as significant in the astrology. But we're going to pivot to a very different character. Um, I want to talk about somebody that you might not know as well, which is Theodor Herzl. And he basically helps make modern Zionism possible. He's considered the father of the movement. He brings together the first Zionist conference in the 19th century, and he provides the vision for making Israel Palestine the homeland. So I'm not saying he's perfect. I'm not saying you have to like him, but he is an important person that we need to take a look at as far as like Jewish social political life. And wouldn't you know, we don't have a great time chart for him, but we have the day of, and he also has some really interesting stuff. He has a sort of half cardinal T square, I would say, sort of in, sort of out. It's like half mutable with a little bit of cardinal. So he's got that Neptune and Pisces, the Venus and Gemini, and then the moon that day gets within, it's unclear. The moon could be, if he gets born early enough, the moon is in Virgo and it's a pretty clearly mutable T square. But it might be like a out of what we call an out of sign aspect. I'm also just really struck that he might, I mean, if he's born very late in the day, it's a little loose, but he would also have a potentially a cardinal T square with the moon in Libra squaring his Jupiter and Mars. So just some like interesting things to kind of consider as we look at this is, his chart sort of does and doesn't fit the pattern as well. but important for us to take a look at. I mean, I think the thing we'll get into as we look at Israel's chart is that Saturn in Leo is quite interesting, because I think there's some very interesting overlaps with this and Israel's chart, both Uranus and Gemini, Saturn in Leo. They all come back. And I think that's interesting to see between what we would call the father of Zionism and the state itself. So let's talk about like how Israel sort of comes to be. Basically, you know, the Brits have been occupying what is the having the British mandate there for a while at this point, and there's tension around like what how do we kind of get out? You know, they've done I think by this point they've done partition in India, and it was real bad, real bad. If you don't know that story, you should look it up because it was real bad. And so they go to the UN looking for like basically a plan to figure out how to work it. Um, and they also propose a partition plan to separate and have a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. And I want to take a look at this chart because this was proposed September 3rd, 1947. Once again, the UN is in New York, which is why this chart is set for New York. We don't have a great timed chart. If you happen to know when this was announced, would love to hear it. So we once again we're seeing Neptune in Libra, and creating a cardinal T square with the moon in Aries and Mars in Cancer. And so you have this additional intensity of the moon and Mars being in each other's sign. Try saying that 5 times fast. I certainly couldn't. So that is striking. And yeah, we also see Pluto and Saturn in Leo. Uranus, right, is in Gemini. So we're already seeing the echoes of, in some ways, Herzl's chart. So I think that's quite striking, particularly those together. Um, let's look at Israel's chart because it both, I mean, obviously, this is Israel is founded, and this is like one of the most critical. This changes Jewish life in the 20th century. You know, uproots a lot of diaspora communities. They return there either willingly or sort of forced by other nations who are mad at how this occurred, and like inflicting violence upon people. Um, there's lots of reasons, both willingly and unwillingly, that people are moving to this state, but it changes Jewish life. It's almost hard to imagine how much it impacted Jewish life. Um, And so this is the chart. And we actually have a really solid, I mean, it's one of the few nations because it's such a modern contemporary nation that we have good data astrologically for it. And so we have a Libra rising chart with Neptune in the first house. We have Venus up in Cancer. I mean, like the cardinal signs are clearly important here. But we also have Saturn in Leo, Uranus in Gemini, um, and all of those things. In fact, I haven't actually realized this until now. Israel's apparently an eclipse baby. Eclipse babies just means that you were born around an eclipse. You're within 2 weeks of an eclipse. And we can triple check it right now. I'm literally going to do the like eclipses. Yeah. So there was an eclipse May 9th, 1948. Yeah. There was an eclipse like okay, 14 minus 9 is 5 days prior to the founding of this nation. If you are born within a really 2 weeks of an eclipse, you're basically an eclipse baby. You're very sensitive to eclipses. Eclipses highlight and are often when pivotal things happen for you in a way that doesn't occur for other folks. So we have an eclipse baby. We have some key cardinal placements. That's going on. But what's interesting is also what's not here. There is no cardinal T square. There's just not. You could try to, squint at sort of maybe with Venus and Neptune, but the out of bound Jupiter, like you're stretching it. You're stretching it. And I'd have to say that. And it's my hypothesis, damn it. Um, Interestingly, too, to see Pluto not in Aquarius, but in Leo, right? We've seen so many of the major legal shifts for Jews with Pluto in Aquarius. This is Pluto in the opposing sign. We haven't really seen that as much. So I think that's interesting. I will give Cat. We have a Uranus Mars pretty close sextile. They're working together. They're not on top of each other, but they're working together. So there's definitely things in this chart that echo, I think, some of the trends we have seen, but also bucks some of the trends that we've seen. And that I think also aligns with just how much Israel is a change for Jewish life in a way that we haven't seen in like 2000, literally 2000 years. And even then, the modern state and nations then are kind of like it's apples and cattle. You can't even put them in the same basket.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't Zionism closely associated with the lion, like as a symbol? So it's just interesting to me to find all this in Leo.
I don't know that the lion is. There's a lot of Jewish symbolism Zionism intentionally uses. Partially because I mean, a lot of Zionists are Jews, right? And so they're going to use that. And the lion is a symbol of strength and monarchy and is a symbol within Jewish iconography. You often will see the name Ari or Aryeh, and that is, I think, lion in Hebrew or related to lion in Hebrew. And so there is something about that. And you see a lot of, how do I put it? A lot of Zionism is about strength and sort of reclaiming strength and masculinity and masculine stereotypes of power, which do feel in some ways very Leo. It's about kind of moving away from the sort of bookishness into like the strong farm land, like transforming the land and sort of the power over the land that you'll especially see in the early periods and sort of is in some ways a critique of in a lot of ways what was sort of traditional Jewish masculinity through a lot of the historical period, which really highlighted book learning. Most of the men that you sort of idealize, if you think about there's a line from what is it, Fiddler on the Roof, when they're doing like a, I think it's Sunrise and Sunset, where they talk about the groom being slender and pale, which seems offhand like not attractive within a lot of traditional Jewish spaces where you wanted learned men were the successful, elevated men. That was a standard of beauty. And this is mostly, I think, in things I've learned about masculinity in Ashkenazi Jewish groups, right? This is not necessarily to speak to other places and other ways that people have defined it, but uh, Zionism, particularly as has a lot of European movement, is in ways a lot of reaction to European Jewry, and another way of thinking of sort of against assimilation or like, are we really safe here? What is safety? And finding another alternative to that, which, in hindsight, I think is much easier to see, is also about dominating non-Western people, right? Like there was a slogan about a people with no land and a land with no people. We know people were on this land. Many who were Arab Christians, Arab Muslims. We also have Jewish Palestinians exist too. Like all of these people existed here. And so some of that I think is also what we see in sort of the Leo strength and the shadow of Leo in this, right? The Pluto of Leo is the domination of land, the exercising of authority, and reclaiming traditional authority in a way that is powerful but can be exploitative. Even if all you had to work off of looking towards the future was Israel's chart, you would know shit is coming and it's coming hard and fast. Mostly because you're like, oh, Pluto's in Aquarius right now, which means they're about to have their Pluto opposition. That's tough. They have Uranus and Gemini. They're about to have their Uranus return, right? Uranus is returning to Gemini. And they have Neptune and Libra. And they're about to have their Neptune opposition. That are three major planets activations all happening at the same time. That alone tells you you're in a major critical turning point for this nation. You're in a critical turning point for understanding its sort of mass appeal and its supporters. You're in a critical point of its understanding of its sort of philosophy, religion, its foreign affairs, and especially like, yeah, how it treats other peoples. We have seen a lot of stuff with like Palestinians and the sign of Aries of late. And so that's becoming a whole thing, as well as finally, like children, pleasure, legacy are all three topics that are coming up. Seems a little loud. Seems a little loud. And we'll get back to that, but I you know, want to also talk about how we see both important Israeli figures that align with some of these transits and hypotheses and the ones that don't. So I'm going to start with somebody a little bit earlier in the process. So David Ben-Gurion, if you know anything about Israeli history, he's the first prime minister. We don't have the best time chart for him, but we're going to just kind of use this and mostly look at the placements. So a couple of interesting things is mostly that Libra stellium and the Saturn overcoming square. So he has Uranus, Venus, Jupiter, and the Sun all in Libra. And Saturn is in a tight square to his Sun. We could argue that, okay, maybe he has a cardinal T square, maybe we don't have the time of his birth right. And so maybe he was born with a Capricorn rising. I think that's kind of pulling at straws to make that hypothesis fit. I'll be blunt. But I do think it's interesting that he does have some important cardinal placements that are in strong discussion with each other. He has a Mars Uranus sextile. No opposition, but they are
I,
working together.
yeah.
You have a kind of a loose Neptune Mars opposition. And more strongly, a Neptune Pluto opposition, which is spicy. But, he's not an eclipse baby. So, just something to consider. He's an important person. I know it's interesting is his ascendant is kind of conjunct Israel's natal Jupiter, which I think is kind of a beautiful synastry for the first prime minister, the first sort of leader, and sort of like kind of having this really important place as far as both um, authority and leadership, but also like meaning and the philosophy of the state. It's also just it's incredibly good synastry for David Ben-Gurion because Jupiter is the ruler of Sagittarius and basically gives him like it like supercharges him personally. It's very, very good for him. So now we got to talk about a guy that I dislike immensely, and that is Benjamin Netanyahu or Bibi. Uh, he's been the prime minister of Israel for a really long time. He's super fucking corrupt. And let's also add on that he's been the leader since October 7th and has had no problems with what's going on. So let's take a look at his chart. First off, he is an eclipse baby. He's born literally the day of an eclipse in Libra, a solar Libra eclipse. Okay, that's already intense. He's already also got a fucking Libra stellium with Mercury and Neptune there as well. So that's a lot. Interestingly, there's at least cardinal squares. There's not really a cardinal T square, but there's two cardinal squares. You've got Uranus squaring his Mercury and Jupiter in a square with his sun and the sun, especially the moon is going to be moving quickly towards it. So there's definitely a lot of activation here. and is quite potent in that sense. Eclipses highlight a major new thing, typically. And so, from a leadership perspective, there is some sort of danger and destabilization typically inherent in them because they highlight major rises and major falls. I find that people born on eclipses or around eclipses, those tend to highlight major changes in their life, in their legacy. And I am assuming the Aries Libra eclipses that we just had, which was a nodal return for Netanyahu, right? We see a massive change and release in mass support for him. Both, I think, within Israel, you do see a major protest movement there, and also internationally, that like he's, I think, considered, somebody that could go to The Hague someday. Um, and I think that's significant. Is it enough to unseat him? Clearly, it hasn't been so far. And also, we have to take into account that this is a different chart than the emancipation. One of the main things is that Venus is not in Scorpio. She's in Sagittarius. So that's a piece of it. So she's not looking to Mars for support. She is looking to Jupiter for support. And right, so we've got a Venus looking to a detrimental Jupiter over here that's kind of caught up in the squares. And Jupiter is looking to, I mean, you've got an interesting thing of, we would call this sort of a, I call it, I mean, there's probably other terms other astrologers use, but you basically have a circle of support in this chart. So Mercury is in Venus's sign. Mercury's looking to Venus. Okay. Venus is in Jupiter's sign. She's looking to Jupiter. Jupiter is in Saturn's sign. Okay. Saturn is up in Virgo. And so Saturn is looking to Mercury. And so what you might be seeing in this chart, and part of maybe his success, is sort of the interlocking planets supporting each other and sort of being this sort of cycle. And the more that you support one, the more you support the others. Um, you know, his, it's not surprising to me that this is a man who has had corruption allegations, and using his authority, using his position, using his career to further his financial interests. That is a Jupiter Saturn reception at its worst. So yeah, so Netanyahu clearly has a lot, and he's clearly, I think, a pivotal person within Israeli history, whether or not you want him to be or not. So based on executive decisions and to keep our episodes nice and tight and juicy, we're going to only give you a sneak preview of how this analysis has already been helpful in noticing when we're going to see major upticks in Jewish life, and specifically using astrology. And I want to take us to June 12th of this year. So June 12th, June 13th, when I initially wrote this article on my blog, I pointed out this date as critical timing, or one that I was like, hey, there looks like there's something that's going to be happening here. And I think that it's particularly important for potential uptick in violence. Well, that is when we saw things get a little bit more rockety between Iran and Israel. If you remember, the visuals were quite staggering. So let's take a look at why that was the time frame. So this, what was happening June 12th, June 13th, astrologically? First off, we get some really intense angles. If we just look at the transits, which we can do, a little bit easier to see, you've got this cardinal T-square, which is the initial reason I looked this up. Saturn, Neptune, the beginning of Aries, squaring Jupiter that had just entered Cancer. And the moon that day, a little bit earlier than this, right, was in a tight opposition to, right, the moon entered Capricorn and immediately opposes Jupiter and immediately is squaring Saturn, Neptune. So all of this is going on. I'm like, already this looks pretty intense, looks important. But let's look at it in comparison to Israel's chart. Well, we've got a Mars return for Israel, which speaks to a couple of things, right? We think of what is Mars about? Soldiers, conflict, pew pew, all of that stuff. It also speaks to foreigners and others in Israel's chart because the seventh house is Aries and that is ruled by Mars. So we could expect something like foreign violence being a topic that comes up. We could also expect Israeli leadership not doing necessarily super well in this moment. Why? Because as much as Jupiter seems hyped in this chart in Cancer, he's kind of fucked. One, I don't care how exalted a planet is. If its ruler, in this case the moon, is broke, it doesn't fucking matter. He's broke. In this case, right, the moon was transiting Capricorn. The moon is in detriment here. It's not great for timing shit if you're working with that. Okay. It doesn't help that natally, right, Israel's moon is in Leo. So there's like multiple weaknesses dealing with the moon in this chart. The moon in Leo in itself is not bad. It's just, it has no angle. It's just, there's a bunch of traditional shit where it's like not great. So you got like an overeager leadership feeling hyped on itself. And you've got Mars, but you've then got the overcoming square of boundaries, authority, resistance from foreigners, AKA in this case, Iran. Really kind of showed up and said, "What's up?" Came guns ablazing. In this case, you would say, well, isn't Saturn suck in Aries? Yeah, absolutely. Saturn sucks in Aries. There's a bit of a mitigation because Mars was in Leo. And so they could at least by sign see each other. That helps not you, the country in this case, Israel. This helps the other. If anything, you want to wait till Mars is struggling in Virgo. If it were me, but I'm an astrologer. So a lot of this chart is going to be highlighting that, right? So I think what we're going to see next time as we talk through, there's significant activation coming up, both with these patterns of eclipses, cardinal T squares, as well as I think what we have to look at, which is to Israel's chart as well, to say, okay, what's coming up? And that is important, I think, from a socio-political level. And I think what gets more murky is, okay, how and which of these charts speaks to Jews in the diaspora, which is, I think, a larger question we are still need to do more research on. Prediction is hard,
Yeah.
right? I don't think that we do this to be able to say, oh, sit and watch, sit back and be right. That's not my reason for doing it. My reason for doing it is to deepen our astrological understanding and also to then say, okay, what do we do with this information? How does it that knowing that there's going to be some massive shifts and changes, like what do we want to do to support each other, be in community with each other? Um, I believe an astrologer who I really respect and like is brilliant is Ali Olami. He does a lot of medieval Islamic astrology. And there's a story he told once about an astrologer predicting a flood and then being able to work with the local authorities to help create preventative measures so that people, the flood had minimized the harm. And that's what I think of when I do this work, which is like, okay, how do we minimize harm or how do we understand the trends that are coming up so that we can navigate that better together? There's lots of this that is beyond us, but as a Jewish person who has to live in the world, I think it's important for me to be able to be like, okay, what are the moments that I need to be aware of and show up and like me either I need to have support or be a support to others. And I think astrology can be a tool for helping us kind of prepare and time for that. The more we know. When things were going down and having to like go back through my notes and being like, oh shit, I did predict this. I didn't feel good about it. I didn't like that I was like, there's something that's happening here, but I wasn't sure at the time. But the fact that like it was that kind of conflict, I think really highlighted both, I think, the importance of this work and also I think is a bit of a foreshadowing of what we're going to need to really be prepared for. I think especially into the early 2030s when the eclipses move back into Aries and Libra and we start having major outer planets with them. I think that's the thing that people forget. Like October 7th happened with an eclipse in the Aries Libra axis. And we're going to have it again. The nodes will be flipped in the early 20, I think it's the early 2030s. And that time frame, you're going to have at least Neptune in Aries still. Um, and I think Jupiter will be in Libra for part of it. I need to triple check my info on that. Like it's looking, I'm nervous. I'm truly nervous, and I'm not exactly sure what we're going to see. We'll get into more of it next time, as I have picked up some important dates for us to take a look at and some hypotheses for what I think is we could be seeing. Um, Thank you for joining us today on this astrological journey, and we will see you next time with what I promise is I shouldn't promise. It's probably the final part in this series, and then we'll get back to the planets and
I
working
guess
with
the second to last. I get you. I bet we're gonna have two more.
We'll see y'all later. I don't know what
Bye.
else to say.